After the earlier conflict ended with defeat of Imperial Germany, America turned her back on Europe, indulged in futile dreams of everlasting peace, and to all intents and purposes disarmed. But World War II was no sooner over than the Cold War with communism opened, and we rearmed with new and deadlier instruments of destruction which threaten, whenever and by whomsoever employed, to snuff out civilization itself. Thus, World War I was a hit-and-run war. We struck late but hard, and quickly withdrew into our shell, like a hermit crab. But World War II was a hit-and-stay war. We struck even harder, and stayed in Europe, Asia, and Africa. In 1963, American air and ground forces are in Great Britain, Germany, North Africa, Japan, Korea, Formosa, South Vietnam, and a score of Pacific islands formerly in enemy possession. And the United States Navy not only patrols every verge of Asia and dives under the polar ice, but protects the lifeline between America and all other bastions of freedom. The important point in turning our back on Europe was rejection by the United States Senate in 1920 of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Although this action was taken mainly for political and personal reasons, revenge against President Wilson and Wilson's own stubbornness, the rejection was undoubtedly popular. There was a feeling of national frustration over the unsatisfactory outcome of the Paris Peace Conference, a belief that we had been sold down the river by Lloyd George and Clemenceau, and that adherence to the League would involve us in conflicts contrary to our permanent interests. President Wilson prophesied on 4 September 1919 that the League is the only conceivable arrangement which will prevent us sending our men abroad again very soon. The only thing that can prevent the recurrence of this dreadful catastrophe. This warning the people heeded not. Americans nevertheless were devoted to the idea of world peace, and the Harding administration, elected in the fall of 1920, felt obliged to do something spectacular to satisfy that aspiration. This took the form of the Naval Arms Limitation Conference at Washington. In 1916, on the eve of war, Congress had passed an act authorizing the building of a navy which, had it been carried out, would have made it the equal to any other two navies of the world. The British government and people, after the war was over, foolishly regarded this as a challenge to the Royal Navy, which had borne the brunt of blue water fighting. The war had thrown such financial burdens on the British that they could not match us ship for ship, and so far as anyone could see, America would always be on their side. Yet British pride and sense of history were too powerful to brook a superior rival, for history seemed to prove that Britain's allies in one war would be her enemies in the next. The suggestion from London of a naval limitation agreement between the 5 leading naval powers, Great Britain, the United States, Japan, France, and Italy, was eagerly taken up at Washington. There the conference opened spectacularly on 12 November 1921 with an American offer to scrap a large part of the naval tonnage then building if other powers would forego building warships themselves. And as the United States had the capability to build the world's most powerful navy, the delegates of those nations hailed Secretary Hughes's offer with almost indecent joy. The results of this conference, after weeks of deliberation, were the famous treaties signed 6 February 1922, setting up the 5-5-3 ratio in battleship and aircraft carrier tonnage between England, America, and Japan, France and Italy each receiving a 1/3/4 ratio, a 10-year holiday on building capital ships, and a restriction on the burthen of all battleships to 35,000 tons. Although this ratio allowed Japan to become the strongest naval power in the Western Pacific, since America had 2 and Britain 3 oceans to defend, Japanese consent had to be purchased by a supplementary agreement on military bases. The United States renounced strengthening, in a military sense, any of her bases, such as Guam and Manila that lay west of Pearl Harbor, and England renounced strengthening any of hers east of Singapore or north of Australia. This provision actually reversed the ratio to 5:3:2 in favor of Japan, as the United States and Great Britain learned to their sorrow 20 years later. The American government and people confidently expected that this agreement would prove the entering wedge for limitation of other types of combatant ships, and to general disarmament on land and sea. But 3 later conferences, called to effect these objects, ended in nothing of importance except an agreement to limit cruisers to 10,000 tons, which we respected and Japan flouted. Having, as they fondly thought, started the ball rolling toward universal peace, the British and American people allowed their armed forces to drift into obsolescence. For about 10 years this hardly mattered, but in the 1930s the German, Italian and Japanese governments began planning war as a shortcut to wealth and power, and building up their armed forces. If England slept, America not only slept but snored. The army was neglected as much or more than the navy, which Congress did not allow to be built up even to what the treaties permitted. Congress would probably have done even less but for the Navy League, a civilian organization founded in 1902, dedicated to keeping the Navy in proper shape. Ironically, the League celebrated its first Navy Day on 27 October 1922, immediately after the administration had consigned some of our best ships to the wreckers' yards. Several factors, besides a general revulsion against war and aversion from Europe, conspired to bring about this lamentable state of affairs. The recession of 1921–1922 and the depression of 1929 to 1933 made Congress unwilling to vote money for armaments that might never be used. Pacifist propaganda in this era was very powerful. One remembers with shame the sneers and jeers at congressional hearings, directed toward conscientious officers who were trying to obtain a few $1 million for army buildup, fleet maintenance and new construction. President Coolidge, although he hated the sea and even disliked reviewing a naval regatta from the presidential yacht, did more for the Navy than any president between Wilson and Roosevelt. Disappointed and irritated that the Second Naval Limitation Conference at Geneva in 1927 could not agree to cut down the world's navies further, he urged the then chairman of the House of Representatives Committee on Naval Affairs to introduce legislation which would bring the United States Navy to full parity with the British. Chairman Butler did so, submitting a program that called for the building of 71 new ships, including 5 aircraft carriers and 25 cruisers, in 9 years. The peace societies then got into action. Congressmen were overwhelmed with protests, and the program was pared to 15 heavy cruisers and 1 carrier. Even this bill was rejected in the Senate. President Coolidge returned to the subject in his Armistice Day address of 1928. The cruiser bill was reintroduced, and this time became law. That was the origin of the Astoria, Indianapolis, and Brooklyn classes, but no keels were laid before 1930, no Brooklyn keels until 1935, and only 2 of these ships were in commission before 1934. President Hoover, a Quaker and a congenital pacifist, trusted to a sort of incantation, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty outlawing war, to keep the peace. He found the British Premier, Ramsay MacDonald, very congenial. After MacDonald, on 24 July 1929, had announced that the Royal Navy would stop work on 2 heavy cruisers, 4 destroyers and 2 submarines, Hoover, when proclaiming the Kellogg-Briand Treaty in force. He announced that the keels of 3 cruisers authorized as far back as 1924 would not be laid, pending another effort to limit navies. The Hoover administration has the sad distinction of being the only one since the 18th century in which not a single naval combatant ship was laid down. Another influence that kept the Navy weak was the propaganda by Brigadier General William Mitchell of United States, to the effect that armies and navies, even aircraft carriers, were obsolete, that land-based air bombers could overcome all the ships and armies in the world. When a prophet habitually prophesies around the clock, he is sure to score some bullseyes as well as numerous misses, but Billy Mitchell, although now canonized by airmen for his few hits, made a very high percentage of bloopers, such as, "The surface ship as an element of war is disappearing. Airplane carriers are useless instruments of war against first-class powers. Effectiveness of anti-aircraft guns is constantly diminishing and never can improve much. A superior air power will dominate all sea areas when they act from land bases, and no seacraft, whether carrying aircraft or not, is able to contest their aerial supremacy. An attempt to transport large bodies of troops, munitions, and supplies across a great stretch of ocean by seacraft, as was done during the World War from the United States to Europe, would be an impossibility." This line of argument appealed to the people and to Congress, since aircraft were not only the newest weapons, but relatively cheap. and some practice sinkings of moored, unarmed and defenceless naval hunks by air bombing in 1921 were cited as proof that no ship could ever threaten our shores if we had a powerful air force. Yet, when the Army's planners first asked for appropriations for B-17s, the flying fortresses that played so great a role in World War II, the Deputy Chief of Staff, General Stanley D. Embick, told them to forget it, since Congress deemed long-range bombers aggressive. As a result of this public attitude, which Congress represented, and of presidential indifference, the Navy from 1920 to 1933 remained static, with an average complement of 7,900 officers and 100,000 enlisted men, manning about 1 million tons of warships. The Royal Navy was almost identical in strength. Except for cruisers, wrote Fleet Admiral King, hardly any combatant ships, no battleships or destroyers, were added to our own fleet during that period, and few were under construction. Moreover, advances in the science of naval construction were hampered by the lack of opportunity to prove new design. Although the Naval Limitation Treaty helped the American taxpayer by suspending battleship construction for 10 years, almost all other naval construction stopped too. Battleships were not only the most expensive warships until the supercarrier came on the scene, but took the longest to build. Before Pearl Harbor, construction of a battleship required an average of 39 months. After that, 32. Fleet carriers before Pearl Harbor required 32 months. After it, 15. Submarines and destroyers before Pearl Harbor required 13 to 14 months. After it, 5 to 7 months. Many senior officers of the Navy envisaged the battles of the next war as long-range gunfire duels between battle lines, as at Jutland, an action so intensively studied at the Naval War College in Newport that one witty officer called Jutland a major defeat of the United States Navy. Actually, only one major battle in which our Navy engaged during the war, the night action off Guadalcanal on 14 to 15 November 1942, was decided by gunfire. All the others were won by ships' torpedoes, and by bombs and torpedoes delivered to the target by aircraft. Accurate gunfire, nevertheless, proved to be indispensable in World War II, both to repel air attack and for shore bombardment to cover an amphibious assault. Although air bombing of an objective supplemented rather than superseded naval bombardment, it was largely the development of air power that doomed the battle wagon to a secondary role. In the face of unwelcome attention from bomber planes, she could no longer hold a battle line. Very few ranking officers of any navy appreciated this. Germany put mighty efforts into producing Bismarck and Tirpitz, and although Admiral Ozawa reached the same conclusion as the progressive American naval leaders, Japan built 18.1-inch gunned Musashi and Yamato and concentrated on battleships in its attack on Pearl Harbor, assuming that their elimination would leave the Japanese Navy supreme. Battleships were very useful in World War II. All those present at Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941 were old enough to vote, but 5 of the 7 sunk or badly damaged, after being raised, repaired and modernized, proved indispensable in covering amphibious operations and for shore bombardment. Even Arkansas, New York and Texas were still dishing it out in the European theatre at the age of 30 or more in 1944. That is not what they were designed to do, but no matter, many classes of naval vessels have proved useful in unintended directions. The submarine was originally conceived by us as a coast defence vessel to torpedo enemy ships approaching our shores. It proved incapable of doing that at Luzon in December 1941, but in the Pacific War the submarine proved to be especially potent in sinking the enemy merchant fleet. Destroyers, originally torpedo boat destroyers, superseded the torpedo boats to become first the cavalry of the sea for scouting, and finally a protective screen for convoys and carriers. Motor torpedo boats were supposed to sneak up on capital ships after dark and torpedo them, a feat seldom performed in World War II, but they became very effective as small, fast gunboats. Nevertheless, a much too big slice of the thin appropriation pie was spent on battleships between wars. This was due fundamentally to Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's teachings to the effect that all other classes of warships would be so outranged and outgunned by them in fleet actions as to be useless. And it was fed by a belief that lighter men of war, cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries and patrol craft could be constructed quickly in an emergency. Not only in harping on battleships, but in other matters too, the Navy itself must share the blame with Congress and the public for unpreparedness. One cause was overemphasis on ship-to-ship competition. Gunnery competition, instituted by President Roosevelt in 1902 as a result of the Navy's bad shooting in the Spanish-American War, was extended to torpedo firing, propulsive engineering and communications, the whole comprising the battle efficiency competition. For several years this helped the Navy, and probably the net result was beneficial. Certainly it was better than no competition at all. But the rivalry thus engendered became almost an end in itself. In order to ensure fairness, rules were standardized and contests held under optimum conditions of fair weather and smooth seas, off the New England coast in summer and in the Caribbean in winter, such as are seldom encountered in battle. A somewhat complacent attitude, to the effect that the United States Navy could outshoot every other navy, developed. But competition and battle practice were useful in discovering defects in ordnance and material and in improving the design of warships. To quote a recent letter from Vice Admiral Deo to the writer, the surface navy, despite lack of funds from Congress or interest by its civilian heads, produced a reasonable semblance of a balanced fleet and operated effectively as one in its training. The spur of officer selection and ship competition was most noticeable, but gradually the means became the end. Thus, while everyone worked hard, we began going in circles. The fleet became more and more tied to bases, operating out of Long Beach, San Diego on a tight fuel budget, chained to the increasingly artificial, detailed mandates of the Office of Fleet Training, whose word was law. The pencil became sharper than the sword. Everyone tried to beat the target practice rules, and too many forgot there was a war getting closer. There was a waiting line for top commands, and tenure of office was so short, often only a year or less, that high commanders came and went, leaving little impression. Paperwork wrapped its deadly tentacles around cabin and wardroom. Smart ship handling, smart crews, eager initiative received little attention, as did the reverse. Glaring defects in guns, ammunition, torpedoes, battle tactics went unnoticed so long as the competition rules made due allowances and gave everyone similar conditions. Fortunately, the battle efficiency competition was abolished in 1935 by the then Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stanley, and our ships began to train under conditions that more nearly approximated what they were to face in war. Even so, there was little if any practice in night fighting, on which the Japanese Navy specialized. That they were so doing in the East China Sea was apparent in 1937 to 1939 to the United States Asiatic Fleet, whose Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Yarnell, repeatedly called it to the attention of the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, but nothing was done. And, although our development in central-directed gunfire subsequent to 1934 was outstanding, no improvements were made in our torpedoes. Poor design and performance of our torpedoes was due partly to obsolescence, leftover stock from World War I, partly to economy. It was a major offence to lose a live torpedo, partly to between-wars inefficiency of the Bureau of Ordnance, and partly to politics in the torpedo factory at Newport. Rhode Island politicians regarded civilian labour there as part of their patronage and supported the local union in resisting efficiency. As one United States naval officer remarked ruefully, "If I fired an incompetent or insubordinate workman, the Secretary of the Navy was visited next day by both Rhode Island senators and a congressman insisting that he be reinstated." After war broke with Japan, we discovered the hard way that not only our torpedo exploders and depth regulation mechanisms were fatally defective, but that the enemy had an oxygen-propelled torpedo which carried half a ton of trinitrotoluene, compared with our 780-pound charge, and could travel 11 miles at 49 knots compared with our range of 7.5 miles at 26.5 knots. And, while the United States Navy, expecting to fight daylight Jutlans at long range, with high-caliber guns, took the torpedo tubes off its cruisers, the Japanese kept theirs, and prepared for the close-range nocturnal hugger-mugger clinch, making abundant use of torpedoes. With these tactics, they reaped rich rewards during the battles around Guadalcanal in 1942 to 1943. The United States Navy, in contrast, was like a city police force equipped only with high-powered rifles, but with no weapons to meet thugs jumping patrolmen at night with automatic pistols and blackjacks. Nevertheless, the Navy strove to attain excellence within the required framework. After 1930, under the lead of wise and aggressive chiefs of naval operations, such as Admirals William Fill Pratt and William H. Stanley, the fleet made substantial progress in several directions, especially naval aviation. The Navy's first aircraft, a bamboo and canvas single-engine biplane, the Curtiss A-1, dates from 1910. Pilot Eugene Ely landed it successfully on an improvised flight deck of cruiser Pennsylvania on 18 January 1911. The Navy's small air arm did so well in World War I that in May 1919 the General Board declared for an immediate development of fleet aviation. A naval air service must be established capable of accompanying and operating with the fleet in all waters of the globe. That year the catapult was invented to enable spotting planes to take off from the decks of battleships and cruisers. The use of planes on board ship incorporated the new weapon and the newly trained aviators with the existing naval organization, instead of keeping it at arm's length, as the Army did with the Army Air Force or forces. These young aviators, unhampered by obsolete equipment or doctrine, injected new life into ships' wardrooms, and there was enough time before war again broke for many to become senior officers, and some to reach flag rank. This early integration of air power with the United States Navy, and our Navy's successful resistance to every effort to deprive it of the air arm, was the basis for the remarkable performances of American aircraft carriers and their planes in World War II. It was also in May 1919 that Lieutenant Commander Albert C. Reid, United States Navy, pilot of NC-4, with a crew of 4, flew the first airplane to cross the Atlantic. The first seaplane tender, Wright, and the first aircraft carrier, appropriately named Langley after another American pioneer in aviation, were commissioned in 1921. The Bureau of Aeronautics, BUAR, was added to the Navy bureaus that same year. The creation of an Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Aviation followed. Aircraft and carriers participated from 1923 on in the annual fleet problems, which were maneuvers aimed at some definite objective, such as attacking the Panama Canal. Langley's performance in the 1925 problem so impressed the Commander-in-Chief that he pressed the speedy completion of Lexington and Saratoga. Both carriers participated in fleet maneuvers and problems from 1929 on, and in 1938 Saratoga launched a successful surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a hint probably not lost on Admiral Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Commensurate improvement went on in carrier aircraft types, fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, but the Japanese Navy improved the first two types faster than we did. USS Ranger, first of our aircraft carriers to be built as such from the keel up, was completed in 1934. The performance of these vessels and their planes brought about a new conception of the aircraft carrier's place in naval warfare. Formerly their functions were to scout for and provide an air umbrella over the battle line. Now roles were reversed. The carrier became the nucleus of a striking force capable of projecting firepower deep into enemy-held waters, and the proud battle wagon, when not employed in shore bombardment, joined the protective screen to the carrier. Other important developments came in connection with amphibious training. A military expedition, the object of which is to land troops on enemy-held territory and establish a beachhead there, is called an amphibious operation. This, the most ancient form of naval warfare, in which the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Norsemen distinguished themselves, became discredited in World War I, and for years thereafter was neglected by all naval powers except Japan. This neglect arose from the misleading claims made by air power fanatics, and from the costly failure of the Dardanelles operation in 1915. Both combined to create the impression that land-based aircraft and modern coast defense guns would slaughter any landing force before it reached the beach. Credit for the revival of amphibious training, and for adapting amphibious tactics to an age of air power and increased gunfire potential, is due to the United States Marine Corps, primarily to Major Earl H. Ellis, United States Marine Corps, who disappeared mysteriously when reconnoitering the Palau Islands in 1923. He was probably murdered by the Japanese because he knew too much, but he had already planted the seed. He pointed out that Japan's insular spiderweb would have to be swept up in case of war, and that the Marines would have to wield the broom, provided the Navy could get them there and cover their landings with gunfire. He even anticipated that we would have to take Okinawa before defeating Japan. Major Ellis's plans were approved by General Lejeune, Commandant of the Marine Corps. In 1921, Marine Expeditionary Force was organized, and in 1923 it performed the first amphibious attack problem on Culebra Island, east of Puerto Rico. Next year, a bigger problem, with 1,700 troops engaged, resulted in a complete foul-up. This convinced the Navy that far more study and training were required before an amphibious assault could dislodge a determined enemy. New landing craft types, even the precursor of the landing vehicle, tracked amphibian tractor, were tried out, and in 1933 the Fleet Marine Force was established. Next year it issued a tentative manual for landing operations which Marine Corps historians regard as the Pentateuch and the Four Gospels of amphibious warfare. As Bob Sherrod writes, the establishment of Fleet Marine Force marks the evolution of the Marine Corps from a simple rough-and-ready gang which could fight banana wars to a specialized organization with a primary mission: the seizure of beachheads as bases for military operations. General John H. Russell, acting Commandant of the Corps, was largely responsible. Gradually, the Marines drew more of the Navy and Coast Guard into their maneuvers. After France fell, and the Army realized that no future American expeditionary force could land at Brest on stone jetties and proceed to the battle area in 40 homes, 8 Chevaux boxcars, it too consented to learn from the Marines and began to take part in their amphibious exercises. Until September 1939, when World War II broke in Europe, the Navy hardly knew what it would be called upon to do in the Atlantic, but for over 40 years it had known what would be expected of it in the Pacific. Responsibility for the Philippines, which, together with a formidable insurrection we bought from Spain in 1898, involved us in Far Eastern power politics and made war with Japan difficult to escape, if not inevitable. And as an example of the haphazard, non-strategic nature of the decision to buy the Philippines, we failed to acquire island approaches to the archipelago on which Spain had put a for sale sign, excepting Guam, which was of slight value without nearby Saipan and Tinian. Out of the welter of events in the Pacific between 1900 and 1941, there emerged two major factors: the growing disorganization of China and the increasing power of Japan. We tried to arrest the one by the open-door policy of John Hay, which meant dissuading European powers and Japan from annexing parts of China or acquiring special privileges in her ports. Then came the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, in which Japan acquired Korea and a new area of influence in Manchuria. It was generally expected that this would not long satisfy Japan, and that the Philippines would be her next objective. As early as 1903, our great authority on naval strategy, Captain Mahan, urged that the United States Navy concentrate in the Pacific. The Joint Army-Navy Board, precursor of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so recommended in 1905. It proposed that the battle fleet be based on Subic Bay, Luzon. President Theodore Roosevelt declined to support this. Had he done so, and if Congress had built up shore installations there as a deterrent, it is possible that Japan would never have attacked us. But one can never tell when something intended as a deterrent may instead become a mere irritant. Basing the battle fleet in the Philippines might have provoked Japan to a sneak attack on Subic Bay, before the opening of the Panama Canal in June 1914 permitted warships to be shifted rapidly from one ocean to another. Japan again increased her power by joining World War I as the ally of Britain, and with very little exertion and minimum loss, acquiring Germany's insular empire, the Marshall and Caroline Islands, and all the Marianas except Guam. President Wilson, more far-seeing about Japan than Theodore Roosevelt had been, protested against these acquisitions at the Paris Peace Conference, and the 1916 naval program, which he strongly supported, had the deterrence of Japan principally in view. Wilson was overruled on the first point, and the planned big navy, as we have seen, was scrapped after the war. Japan kept her insular spiderwebs, on which dozens of airfields and numerous naval bases could be built and were built after 1936. In the event of war with Japan, the United States Navy's Orange Plan looked to the Army to defend Manila and hold out for an estimated 3 to 4 months until the battle fleet could cross the Pacific and raise the siege. Japanese possession of the mandated islands made this task impossible unless key positions in the Marshalls and Carolines were first secured and the Spiders cleaned out. That increased the estimated time for the army to hold out in Luzon to 9 months, and as we have seen, a part of the 1922 Washington Agreement was our renouncing the right to strengthen our bases in Guam and the Philippines. An impossible situation in grand strategy had been created for us, largely by our own folly. We were promising to defend the integrity of China and of the Philippines, without anything near the military means to implement such a policy. In the meantime, the liberal, Western-oriented groups in Japanese politics, which had been participating in the collective security measures of the League of Nations, were being harassed and terrified by a movement roughly parallel to Hitler's German authoritarians. Kodoha, as it was called, aimed to place Japan under army control, liberate China, India, the Philippines and all East Asia from foreign imperialists, and place all Asiatic countries under Japanese hegemony. Liberal politicians were assassinated, and in 1931 the Japanese Kwantung Army moved into Manchuria. Secretary Stimson was unable to persuade President Hoover to do more than protest against the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and of Shanghai later in the same year. A commission of the League of Nations condemned the Japanese action and demanded that she retire from Manchuria. Japan's reply was to withdraw from the League of Nations and to announce that on her part the naval limitation treaties would end in 1936. Harbinger of fairer weather for the Navy was the appointment of the Honourable Carl Vinson of Georgia in 1931 to be chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives, a position that he still held as chairman of an enlarged House Armed Services Committee in 1962. Mr. Vinson was not only well disposed toward the Navy, he made himself an expert on its technique and supported its aspirations to help defend the country. No member of Congress, writes Rear Admiral Führer, has ever shown a greater understanding of naval needs, nor a greater mastery of the practical politics necessary to get the legislative branch of the government to recognize these needs, than Carl Vinson. Among the promoters of a powerful navy, Carl Vinson deserves a high place. But the number one architect of victory was the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, who became President of the United States on 4 March 1933. Franklin D. Roosevelt brought a new deal for the armed forces as well as for the nation, yet he was not yet ready to end appeasement of Japan. Even though Japan had bowed out of naval limitation, both Britain and America regarded themselves bound by the treaties. But the United States Navy had been allowed to fall so low that there was a vast gap to be filled before even treaty strength could be attained. Congress finally began responding to frequent prods from President Roosevelt, Mr. Vinson, and the leading admirals. The first new construction authorized in years of the Brooklyn-class light cruisers, Craven-class destroyers, carriers Enterprise and Yorktown and 4 submarines, came as a corollary to the National Industrial Recovery Act of 16 June 1933, the avowed purpose being to relieve unemployment. This build-up taxed the ingenuity of the Navy bureaus, especially ships and yards and docks, because during the lean decade many shipbuilding and other firms that depended on naval orders had been liquidated, and their designers, draftsmen and skilled workers had obtained other jobs or gone on relief. Thus, the rearmament program started almost from scratch and could not be greatly accelerated until wartime. For example, the Vinson-Trammell Act of 1934 provided an 8-year replacement program which would require 10 years to attain treaty strength. The first 5 treaty 10,000-ton heavy cruisers of the New Orleans class, which had been authorized 5 years earlier, joined the fleet in 1934. Despite nationwide unemployment, Congress for several years refused to increase the authorized personnel of the Navy, which in 1935. With only 8,063 officers and 82,500 men, personnel had to operate ships with about 80% of their proper complement. 2 years later, a new ceiling of 100,000 bluejackets was established. Between 1935 and 1940, the Atlanta class of anti-aircraft cruisers was designed, and several types of fleet auxiliaries, including minesweepers, were transferred from the drafting boards to the building ways, All battleships of the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes were designed in these years, but only North Carolina and Washington were completed before we entered the war, our first battleships in 18 years. These ships were characterized by 16-inch main batteries, thick armored decks for protection from air bombing, heavy fragment protection around important control stations, modern 5-inch anti-aircraft guns in twin mounts, and the forerunners, found by battle experience to be inadequate, of the present types and numbers of close-range anti-aircraft weapons. In August 1939, when Admiral William D. Leahy was relieved as Chief of Naval Operations by Admiral Harold R. Stark, he could look back with some satisfaction at the increase of naval strength during the 2.5 years of his incumbency. But, as he wrote in his last report, the Navy must be sufficiently strong in every essential element, and it must be adequately trained in order to take the offensive in the event of war and defeat the enemy fleet wherever it can be brought to action. In several respects, the Navy was not well rounded. Very few fast, modern auxiliaries had been finished. On 1 July 1939, the Navy had only 2 transports, 3 cargo ships, 3 oilers, and 1 ammunition ship in commission. And on 1 December 1941, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, Pacific had only 1 transport and 1 oiler ready to accompany the fleet's trans-Pacific trek if and when war broke out. But the chief worry that Leahy bequeathed to his successor was the subject of bases. It was probably a good thing in the long run that the United States Navy was ill provided with bases in the Pacific, in comparison with the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Royal British. Want of them made American officers more self-reliant and their ships more self-sufficient. Nevertheless, failure to develop adequately what bases we had meant a rapid withdrawal of American sea power from the Western Pacific when the Japanese struck. After Japan denounced the Naval Limitation Treaty in 1936, the United States was free to strengthen all bases, anywhere. But all that could be got out of Congress was a few $1 million for seaplane bases at Wake and Midway Islands, and at Kodiak, Alaska, and Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians. These were indeed useful, only the first named was lost to the enemy. In 1938, a special board headed by Admiral Hepburn recommended the building of a fully equipped fleet and air base at Guam to help defend the Philippines. Congress, after a heated debate, turned this down, largely for fear of provoking Japan, and the little that was done to strengthen the defences of Manila Bay proved to be wholly inadequate. Immediately upon the outbreak of war in Europe, in September 1939, the appropriate bureaus of the Navy drew up comprehensive estimates of warship requirements. The problem was no longer one of designing the best ship of a limited size, but of selecting the most desirable combination of basic characteristics. With the aid of previous experience, designs were completed for new types of destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. By 7 December 1941, plans had been completed for the Fletcher-class destroyers, the 6-inch Cleveland-class cruisers, the 8-inch Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, the Essex-class aircraft carriers, the first destroyer escorts, and a dozen different classes of auxiliaries. In order to meet the demands of modern warfare, more ammunition was required for an increased number of guns, more crews to man the gun mounts, more fuel capacity for a wider cruising radius, more powerful machinery to deliver greater shaft horsepower and develop more speed. Increased tonnage was inescapably necessary to carry the added weight, with sufficient reserve buoyancy and stability for the ship to survive serious damage. New main propulsion plants, using high-pressure, high-temperature steam, were introduced during the pre-war period. These reached such a state of development that United States ships were able to travel enormous distances without shipyard upkeep and overhaul, in many cases over 100,000 miles within a single year. Vast improvements in the diesel engine industry provided another source of propulsive power, which would be utilized to the staggering total of 35 million, out of a total of some 90 million shaft horsepower during the war. A number of experimental laboratories and testing stations, maintained by various bureaus of the Navy, were staffed with technicians and scientists. Among such establishments were the Taylor Ship Model Basin, wind tunnels, powder, gun, torpedo, mine and aircraft factories, ordnance proving grounds, as well as testing and experimental stations. A naval research laboratory was established in 1928 for high-level work. Owing to meagre appropriations, it lost primacy in radar to the Royal Air Force Laboratory in England. But that eventually benefited us too, and our research laboratory helped the Royal Navy in other fields. The National Research Council collaborated with the Naval Research Laboratory, and also with the research activities of private industry. This laid foundations for the phenomenal success of the Navy in mobilizing American scientists and scientific resources for wartime purposes. During Franklin D. Roosevelt's first administration and the first 2 years of his second, 1937 to 1939, progress in national defense was substantial but slow. A 5-day-week law, designed to spread employment, made construction lag, nor did our foreign policy substantially change. What the Japanese called the China Incident of 7 July 1937 inaugurated their invasion of China proper, in the course of which they sank United States river gunboat Panay, without producing a noticeable dent on the American people's determination to avoid war. The widely publicized report of a committee headed by Senator Gerald Nye in 1934 proved by innuendo that bankers and munitions makers, merchants of death, had got America into World War I, and Congress responded to the public opinion thereby created by passing a series of Neutrality Acts. These renounced most of the neutral rights for which we had fought England in 1812 and Germany in 1917. Sale or transport of munitions to a belligerent was forbidden, 1935, loans to belligerents were prohibited, 1936. These were applied to the Civil War in Spain, but sale of munitions was permitted on a cash and carry basis, 1937. And the President was authorized to prohibit American ships from entering danger zones so as to prevent incidents, 1939. Thus, to peace by naval limitation and peace by incantation, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, we added peace by an ostrich-like isolation. When war broke in Europe in September 1939, the vast majority of the American people wished to stay out of it. American sympathies were strongly pro-Ally, but it was assumed that Hitler's Third Reich was a big bluff, and that the French Army and Royal Navy could defeat him in short order. There were a few exceptions allowed to the 5:5:3 ratio. The most fortunate for us being permission to convert 2 43,500-ton battle-cruiser hulls, still on the ways, into carriers Lexington and Saratoga, of 33,000 tons each, despite a treaty limitation of 25,000 tons on aircraft carrier construction. Japan, by way of compensation, converted battlecruiser Akagi and battleship Kaga, substituted for Amagi, destroyed in the Great Earthquake, to carriers. In accordance with the 1922 treaties, the United States Navy scrapped the 76% completed battleship Washington, including 6 43,200 tonners of South Dakota class, 11 to 38% complete, and 4 battle cruisers building, sisters to Lexington and Saratoga. On these ships, $300 million had already been spent. In addition, dreadnoughts Delaware, North Dakota, Michigan, and South Carolina, 12 years old, were scrapped, and 15 pre-dreadnoughts, some as old as the Spanish-American War, were broken up, used as targets or made museum pieces. Originally, the United States Navy was also to have scrapped Colorado and West Virginia, retaining only Maryland as a post-war 16-inch gunned battleship. England to have kept Hood and Japan Nagato to balance Maryland. Japan, however, presented a plea to keep new battleship Mutsu, since Japanese schoolchildren had contributed their pennies to pay for her. So there was another compromise, whereby the United States Navy kept Colorado and West Virginia, and England built 2 new equalizers, Nelson and Rodney. The Royal Navy, in accordance with the treaty, scrapped 14 dreadnought battleships and 6 dreadnought battlecruisers, 7 to 15 years old, totaling 415,000 tons, and renounced building 4 Superhood-class battlecruisers. Japan used as a target and sank the completed 40,000-ton battleship Tosa, gave up constructing 2 more battlecruisers, and scrapped 8 pre-dreadnought battleships, 11 to 16 years old. A re-examination after World War II makes the balance fairer than it seemed at the time. 8 of the 18 battleships retained by the United States Navy were completed in 1917 or later. But only 3 of the 16 battleships retained by the Royal Navy, and 5 of the 6 battleships retained by Japan were that new. Both Britain and Japan had in the blueprint stage 8 18-inch gunned battleships, which they gave up building. The 6th year of the appeasement of Hitler by England and France ended on 3 September 1939, when he invaded Poland. For another year, American policy toward the European war was dictated by the public's overwhelming desire to keep out of it, at almost any price. At the same time that President Roosevelt announced American neutrality, he declared a limited emergency, 8 September. The immediate effects of this on Congress, as respects the Navy, were to increase authorized enlisted strength to 191,000 and to allow the President to recall reserve officers and men to active duty as needed. Our first positive action toward the war, typically if paradoxically negative, was to organize the Neutrality Patrol. This was decided at the Congress of American Republics at Panama on 2 October. Hitler had been nourishing fifth columns of German authoritarians in many Latin American republics, and the gravest danger to the Americas at that time appeared to be German subversion. The idea behind the Neutrality Patrol was to create and protect a neutral zone extending an average of 300 miles off the American coastline, except off Canada, for Canada loyally declared war when her mother country did. West of this line, belligerents were forbidden by the Congress of American Republics to conduct military operations. 8 groups of the United States Navy, mostly destroyers and cruisers, covered the North American sector from Newfoundland to Trinidad. This, writes Captain Roskill of Royal Navy, was unquestionably an unfavourable move from the Allies' point of view. On the other hand, Admiral Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, regarded the Neutrality Patrol as an outrageous limitation on the operations of his submarines. Although naval and military men are often accused of trying to fight a new war with the tactics of the last one, the reverse was true here. Neither Germany nor England realized that World War II in the Atlantic would closely resemble World War I. In both wars, Germany tried to disrupt England's communications and sink Allied tonnage with U-boats, whilst England counterattacked the submarines and imposed a surface blockade of Germany. But neither side thought it would be like this in 1939. Germany had fewer than 50 submarines ready for offensive operations when war broke, and a very low production schedule. The Royal Navy was not provided with mines to protect British harbours, or with nearly enough ships for escort of convoy and anti-submarine work. The reasons given for this lack by Admiral Sir William James are equally applicable to the United States Navy when it entered the war more than 2 years later. It was thought better to spend limited budgets on battleships, carriers, and other big ships that took a long time to build, rather than on a multitude of escorts and other small craft which it was believed could be improvised when war broke out. Another lesson of the last war was the necessity of convoying merchant shipping and the folly of trying to cope with submarines by hunting them all over the place, looking for a needle in a haystack, as Captain Mahan described such tactics. The Royal Navy did organise merchant convoys to the extent of its supply of escorts, but spurred by Winston Churchill and other civilians, it also wasted time and effort on hunter groups. After a big fleet carrier, His Majesty's ship Courageous, had fallen victim to a U-boat while engaged in one of these hunts, the British stopped them, and after the United States entered the war, Admiral King set his face sternly against anything of the sort. To anticipate, the entire experience of the war demonstrated that the heavily escorted merchant convoy, supplemented by an escort carrier group on its flank, was by far the best way to get U-boats, because the merchantmen acted as bait. The convoy was not a defensive weapon, as so often charged by ignorant or prejudiced people, but the best sort of offensive, besides being the only way to ensure safe transportation of men and material.